All right, welcome back, Sebastian here. So today, in lieu of doing review, likely power rankings as well, not entirely sure about that, but in lieu of those videos, I'm going to be doing a predictions for the 2026 F1 grid. So most drivers, I would say, are under contract for 2026. So there's not that many seats available. Definitely not as many as last year. So there's probably going to be a lot less movement, but could still be quite a few interesting situations to resolve, as well as a brand new team in Cadillac joining the grid for 2026, which does add an extra element that we didn't have this past year. So I'm going to be doing this in order from, I would say, least likely to see any changes, or I'd say most certain, to those where there's a lot of uncertainty at this point about who's going to be driving for them. So the first, I'd say, three teams, I would say, are pretty much about the same. I'd say pretty much locked on. There shouldn't be any changes to any of these lineups whatsoever. And the first of those is at Haas. Currently driving for the team are Ollie Behrman and Esteban Ocon. I honestly think both drivers have done a pretty decent job this season. Ocon, I think, has been better in the races, whereas Behrman's actually winning the head-to-head in qualifying. And there aren't really any candidates who would realistically come from out of Formula One to supplant either of those two drivers, and both drivers have contracts for 2026. So for Haas, I'm going to stick with the same lineup, Ocon and Behrman. Now, the next team that I think, again, pretty certain is Ferrari, both drivers under contract for 2026. And I think both drivers are performing reasonably well. The only reason anything would have changed this season would be if Hamilton had an absolutely disastrous first season at Ferrari, but he's been pretty good. I think he's been all right. He has been a little bit worse than Leclerc, but he has been getting better recently, and it'll be interesting to see how the two of them kick on for the second half of 2026, second half of 2025, I should say. So for me, Leclerc and Hamilton almost certainly going to be the lineup for Ferrari in 2026. Now, for a third and final team that I would say very easy to predict who's going to be in the lineup is McLaren. Their drivers 1-2 in the championship, both relatively young, both have contracts for next year, and I think in all likelihood will retain the same lineup and will keep Piastri and Norris into 2026. Absolutely no reason for McLaren to change their lineup whatsoever. Now, this is where, after these first three teams, this is where I think there's potential. I'd say the next two teams, there's potential for the lineup to change only if things go massively askew, massively awry at Red Bull. Now, of course, there's been a lot of change recently at Red Bull. I did my video a couple weeks ago. A lot of key personnel have been leaving the last 2 years, and of course, the big one, Christian Horner, left the team a couple weeks ago now as of recording of this video. And of course, what happens with Max Verstappen for 2026 is a source of massive speculation at this point in silly season. And as a result, there are a few drivers who I think, should Max Verstappen leave, I think some of the drivers on the next teams that I'm going to talk about could potentially be, potential bio candidates if Red Bull feels we really need to have a really established driver to be our next number one guy. I think, again, very low likelihood, but I think there's potential for some of the drivers on the next teams I'm going to be talking about that Red Bull could try to buy out one of their contracts to be used as their driver. Kind of similar to what happened with Bottas and Mercedes in 2016 and 2017 when Rosberg was suddenly retired and Mercedes basically bought out Bottas's Williams contract and basically brought him in for 2017. So the first of those two is Williams. Of course, their two drivers for 2026 are Alex Albon and Carlos Sainz. In all likelihood, that will be the lineup that will stay on for 2026. Both of them have contracts for next year. But of course, I think both of them, Sainz has had, I think, a tricky start to life at Williams. Albon's been pretty good this year. Both of them are formerly part of the Red Bull system. And I do think there's a small possibility that should Verstappen leave the team at the end of 2026, or at the end of 2025, that Red Bull might try to poach one of those two drivers to be their lead driver for 2026. Whether either of those two drivers would want to do that is again yet to be seen, or whether those would be the top options, again, is also one that would be not super certain. But again, I think realistically, probably Albon and Sainz will stay at Williams for 2026. Now, the next team I think is a similar boat to Williams. Likely same lineup as this year. Both their drivers are under contract, and that is Sauber with Hulkenberg and Bortoleto. Now, I'm predicting lineup to remain unchanged. Bortoleto's been very good in qualifying. Again, a little bit of work needs to be done in the races, but still nothing that's unusual for a rookie. And I think highly likely he'll stay for 2026. Hulkenberg, I think, again, really good. Got his first podium in F1 last time out at the British Grand Prix. I think for him qualifying, again, there's been some concern. I think Bortoleto's starting to get the measure of him in qualifying. The race performance is still really, really good. And I could see a potential situation where, if Red Bull come calling because they have an empty seat and they have no drivers, I think Audi would not let Bortoleto leave. I think he's too valuable for them. But I think for the right price, I could see them letting Hulkenberg go to Red Bull should Red Bull come calling. But that being said, I still think most likely situations we see this driver lineup again for 2026. Now, Aston Martin, this is a bit of a tricky one. Again, a bit like the last two I've talked about. I think Aston Martin's current two drivers, Alonso, Stroll, are under contract for 2026. Stroll, for the obvious reasons in that he is Lawrence Stroll's son. It seems like, in the past, they never really had a definitive contract length. It's just kind of been, Stroll's back again next year. And he just kind of magically shows up. But I think last summer, 2024, they did say his contract wasn't until 2026. So it's possible 2026 is the last we'll see of Stroll in F1. Again, I think there's many people who wish that would happen, but again, hard to say at this point. And of course, you have Fernando Alonso driving at a very, very high level. I think he's been very good. I think depending on what happens with Mercedes, there are certain permutation combinations of outcomes where, for example, if Verstappen is to go to Mercedes, but Mercedes keep Antonelli and let Russell go, I think Russell would be an excellent piece for Aston Martin to try to poach. Who they drop in that situation, I think, is yet to be seen, and that would be, I think, from an outside perspective, would be a very easy decision to go with a lineup of Alonso and Russell for 2026. But if you're Lawrence Stroll, it might be a bit of a trickier decision. But that being said, I still think likely we're going to see Stroll and Alonso back in green for 2026. And again, I've been alluding to this kind of recently with who I've been talking about leaving, potentially going elsewhere. With who I think will be where with my predictions. But that being said, I do think that there's a degree of certainty with some seats and a little bit less so with others. Now, Racing Bulls is a fascinating one. I think realistically, Arvid Lindblad is probably going to get promoted to F1 next year at the age of 18, same age as Antonelli this year. That I think is pretty certain. Who his teammate is, I think, is a little bit less certain. It could honestly be one of Tsunoda. It could be Lawson, it could be Hadjar. It really depends on what Red Bull decide to do. Now, of course, Tsunoda's always kind of been seen as a Honda driver, and with 2026 being the first year without Honda, I think realistically, more likely than not, Tsunoda's probably just going to get cut loose from the Red Bull program entirely, and he'll have to find his own way elsewhere. Will he be in F1 in 2026? That's yet to be seen, and as for my predictions, you'll have to look a little bit later to see if he shows up or not. But I don't see him going back to Racing Bulls, and I do think Hadjar has been the better of the two drivers, and I think realistically, I think I could definitely see him potentially replacing Tsunoda at Red Bull. So again, that's a bit of a sneak peek for my Red Bull prediction, but that leaves their other driver, Lawson, as well as Lindblad. I think for Lawson, I think he's been okay, not great. I definitely think his one lap pace has left quite a bit to be desired, and I think that's the big thing holding him back, which is something I was worried about before he came into F1, given his qualifying results at the Formula 2 level. But that being said, with the change that they're making, if they decide to promote Hadjar, then they don't really have a second rookie that they can bring in to replace. So I do think that they will just keep Lawson on for another year just because they don't really have any better options. So I'm going with Lawson and Lindblad as my lineup for Racing Bulls for 2026. Again, excuse the poor Photoshop there of Lindblad, but again, I don't have a picture of him in a Racing Bulls outfit. So Mercedes, this is the big one. So Of course, right now it kind of feels like last year at this time, Carlos Sainz was kind of the roadblock in the drivers in the dam, the proverbial dam in the F1 driver market. Given that what he did really was kind of going to set the stage for what everyone else did, and it feels like right now Verstappen is kind of a similar position in the driver lineup, in the driver market, I should say. He has a contract, of course, until 2028 at Red Bull, but there's been so much smoke, so much fire. Russell basically admitted in the press conference in Austria that, Mercedes and Verstappen were talking. Verstappen, I think, obviously he's very loyal to Red Bull, but, so many of the people that he was loyal to at Red Bull have already left, or I think are realistically leaving in the next year or so. This is a very different Red Bull team than the one that he joined in 2016. And so I think, if Verstappen is able to, I think if he wants to be bold, if he wants to give himself the best chance of winning from 2026 onwards, I do think that he should look for an alternative. I think Mercedes being a works team, they did very, very well the last time that we had an engine change. And this is what this, regulation change is going to be, an engine change, given the massive change to the power units in 2026. And given how much smoke that there's been recently, I honestly think that at this point there's a real possibility that it could happen. So that is what I'm predicting for 2026. I'm predicting Max Verstappen to be joining Mercedes for the 2026 season. In terms of his teammate, I think it's a really tricky one for Toto Wolff. I think, he's brought Antonelli along. He's invested so much in his junior career. I don't think he wants to let him go. And so I do think that Antonelli will still be on the grid next year, but I don't see him being at Mercedes. I do think that Mercedes are going to bring together the team from hell, if you will, Verstappen and Russell, two drivers who we know don't get along that well. But as Toto Wolff alluded to recently, I had Rosberg, I had Hamilton together, and we survived. And so he's bringing together two very, very strong drivers at basically the peaks of their careers, very close in age. And it'll be very interesting to see what happens if we get this team for 2026. If they have the best car on track, I think almost certainly they win the Constructors' Championship with that lineup. If there's another team that's in competitive with them, if they only have one strong driver, it might potentially compromise the Drivers' Championship. But I think looking at all the other lineups, I think honestly not too likely in that respect. But that being said, I think given how much smoke we have, I do think I'm going to predict a Russell and Verstappen lineup for Mercedes. Now, of course, that brings us to Red Bull, who have lost their biggest star asset in Verstappen at this point, given that I predicted he's going to Mercedes. Now, I think one driver who I think will be going there is Isaac Hadjar. And I think either a lineup of Hadjar, someone else, or a lineup of Hadjar and Verstappen is, pretty likely. So I do think, Hadjar, pretty good chance he replaces Tsunoda at Red Bull, given Tsunoda's, struggles this year. With 2026, of course, will be a massive reset in terms of the car. And hopefully Red Bull will not be down this incredibly, narrow developmental pathway where the setup of the car is so extreme, so wild that that the drivers other than Verstappen are basically unable to score points in it. And so hopefully for Hadjar, even if the car is not quite as good as this year with maybe a poor chassis, maybe a poor engine, hopefully it's a more drivable car than the one that Red Bull have this year. Now, of course, in this scenario, I've already predicted that Verstappen's left Red Bull. So Red Bull are really going to need an experienced second driver to join the team. And so while the team has had their differences with this driver over the years, I think a lot of the people who've had differences with him are probably not going to be in those positions anymore. And so I'm actually going to predict in a very strange driver lineup, I'm going to have Bottas and Hadjar be the lineup for Red Bull in 2026. I think Bottas's one lap speed is still there. Showed that he could get into Q2 in a very, very poor Sauber last year. Again, points were not great, but the one lap pace was really good. And I think even with a year out being Mercedes reserve driver, I think he should still be on it. And I think a mixture of experience in Bottas, youth, and Hadjar is an okay lineup. Not a great lineup for sure, but it's an okay lineup. And even if Red Bull struggle with a poor engine in 2026, I think this is a competent enough lineup that I think it should be okay. Now, Alpine is a real question mark. I think for Alpine, one driver who I think almost certainly is going to be driving for them next year is Pierre Gasly. Gasly's been very, very good this year. He scored all of the team's points. But as for his teammate, I think there's going to be a lot of uncertainty around that. Colapinto, of course, driving for the team right now, has not been really good and definitely nowhere near as good as he was when he was driving for Williams. And whether that's just simply a characteristic of this Alpine car and the fact that, maybe Colapinto is perhaps not the most adaptable driver, is very good in certain machinery that drives a certain way and maybe not so good in other machinery, is hard to say at this point, but I don't think he's really shown enough to warrant a second year at Alpine. I do think they're going to start looking elsewhere for other options. Now, of course, Alpine are going to be a Mercedes customer team from 2026. So again, Toto Wolff, after basically having dropped his young protege Kimi Antonelli for Max Verstappen, is of course going to be looking for somewhere to put him, and Alpine is exactly where I'm predicting that he'll go. So I'm predicting for Alpine for 2026, lineup of Gasly and Antonelli, and I think with Antonelli joining Alpine, I think they'll probably have discounted engines as well. So that leaves us to our last team, and that is Cadillac. Cadillac, I think, is probably one of the more difficult teams to pick. They don't have a team right now, and of course they have no kind of incumbent drivers who I think would be, more often than not would be predicted to retain their seat for 2026. And so there's a lot of question marks there. I think they really wanted an American driver, and I think Colton Herta would have been their number one choice, but looking at the IndyCar standings, he's nowhere really close to the top 4, and that top 4 is what he would need to be able to get a super license to be able to drive in F1. Palou would be another interesting option, but I think he said multiple times that he doesn't want to come to F1 just to be in a backmarker car. So I think, in terms of, a driver for the American audience, I think the best that they're going to be able to do is going to be Sergio Perez, which I think, looking at Tsunoda's struggles for in the Red Bull right now, I do think it kind of suggests that, maybe Perez wasn't driving that poorly last year. So I do think, obviously Mexican sponsorship money is going to help a bit here. Perez is pretty familiar to the American market, especially, a lot of Hispanic fans really come out to support him. And we see that, at Miami, at COTA, and I guess to an extent Vegas as well. So I think in that sense, I think, Perez would be a really, solid option for Cadillac. Now, I think for Cadillac, having two, veteran drivers in their mid-30s would be a bit redundant. So I do think that they're going to try to go for a younger driver. Zhou's obviously been linked to the seat. Mick Schumacher's been linked to the seat. Neither of them really, I think, have the ceiling to really warrant a second chance in Formula One. So instead, I'm going to bring back another former Verstappen teammate in Yuki Tsunoda, of course, who at this point has been dropped by Red Bull in my future simulation at this point. I think he would be a really good option for Cadillac. He's still relatively young. He's going to be 25, turning 26 years of age next year. And so I think, he's still a pretty quick driver, and I think, would be a really good, solid choice to go alongside Sergio Perez in 2026 at Cadillac. So there you go. That is my 2026 F1 grid predictions. To be honest, so much of this rests on, Max Verstappen, and should Max Verstappen stay at Red Bull, I think that would make leave a lot of changes. I think primarily the big change would be that Mercedes would almost certainly be Antonelli Russell should Verstappen opt to stay. I think if Verstappen stays at Red Bull for 26, that would mean that Hadjar would join him there. And then for Alpine, I would say probably Bottas and Gasly, or Gasly and Aaron would probably be the lineup there at Alpine. So again, I think Verstappen at this point is really the dam in the F1 driver market, and what he decides to do and what his contract allows him to do, I think is going to be the big determining factor to see, how everyone else, sorts out for next year. So even though it's not quite the deluge, the massive change that we saw this past year, going from 2024 to 2025, there should, I think, still be the potential for some interesting moves in the driver market this year. And at the very least, even if a lot of drivers end up staying at the same seat, you still have Cadillac. They're the brand new team who are going to have to pick up a brand new driver lineup. And so for 2026, for the first time in a decade, instead of 20 drivers on the grid, we're going to be having 22 drivers on the grid. So thank you so much for watching, and that is my F1 grid predictions for 2026.